Good evening. Welcome to Asia Society Hong Kong Center. I hope you've enjoyed the viewing of Allegiance, the musical, a 2015 Broadway hit that was really a tremendous success. I saw it on Broadway in 2016, right before it closed. So I'm really delighted that all of you had a chance to watch the performance, the broadcast from the original Broadway musical. So we're really delighted that you can join us. We are really honored tonight to have the star of Allegiance with us. Mr. George Takei is somebody who needs no introduction. Many of us grew up watching him as Sulu, and he has been really an activist as well as a wonderful Asian American role model. And currently, he has a bestseller out, New York Times bestseller. They call us Enemy, and we want to talk more about the book during the discussion. So, in the meantime, I'm really delighted to welcome Mr. George Takei to tonight's program. George,
Good
welcome.
evening. Good to
Good
be here
evening.
with you. Incidentally, my surname is pronounced Takei, but
Takei.
I have no objection to the mispronunciation Takai because that's a Japanese word that translates into English as expensive. So
Oh,
I'd be more than happy to accommodate you. I'll let you
okay.
have my agent's
I'm
name.
just going to call you George
Yes,
because,
please do.
and in fact, my brother's name is George, so I feel really really delighted. I feel I forgive the intrusion and the mispronunciation, but also I feel like I know you. In fact, so well, facing history when you spoke for ACE50, I'm on the board of that, and really hearing your discussion, which is again tonight's discussion is about your experience in the as age 5 in turn at that age and also talking about how the musical came about, the telling of your story, and also your book, again telling of your story, often the story of Asian Americans, and we don't hear enough of it. So to be able to bring that story to Broadway, to a mainstream audience, to an audience that doesn't know the Japanese internment story, so how did that came about? And can you tell us more about that?
Well, it's been my mission in life to share that chapter of American history which we Japanese Americans experience, but so many Americans don't know about yet. Uh, I make assumptions of people. I consider, people that I have conversations with to be well informed, educated people. And when I share with them my childhood imprisonment by my own government, the United States of America, and we're Americans, they are shocked and aghast that something like that actually happened. Uh, and so, I have this as a mission in life to raise the awareness of that chapter of American history so that we learn the lessons from it. And I've written my autobiography, which was published in 1994. And then I took my childhood portion of that book and uh, had it republished as a graphic memoir targeting a younger audience. Uh, I wanted to reach teenagers, post preteens, because when I was a kid, I loved comic books, and at that age, you're absorbing in all the information you get through your pores, and they're going to be the voters of tomorrow, and hopefully the movers and shakers of tomorrow. So I wanted to reach them. So I did it as a graphic memoir and titled it They Called Us Enemy, because that is what they called us. They categorized all Japanese Americans then as enemy alien, which was crazy. My mother was born in Sacramento, California. My siblings and I were born in Los Angeles, California. My father was born in Japan, but his father became a widower when my father was a young boy, and he decided to come to America with his two boys and start life anew. And so my father was born in Japan, but brought to San Francisco by my uh, widower grandfather with his older son, and the younger son was my father. And so my father was raised and educated in San Francisco as an American. And so we were an American family. And yet, because we looked like this, we looked just like the people that bombed Pearl Harbor. And and so they categorized us as enemy aliens. Both were untrue. And yet, this country was swept up by hysteria because of the terror of that bombing. That surprise bombing by Japan killed more than 2,400 people in Honolulu, Hawaii. And that fear, that terror, swept across the Pacific to the West Coast and then rolled across the country. And the entire country was looked at Japanese Americans, American citizens of Japanese ancestry, with suspicion and fear and outright hatred simply because we looked like the people that bombed Pearl Harbor. And it began with assaults on Japanese Americans, which is still happening again today in America. This Asian hate, this violence against particularly elderly Asian Americans. Uh, After Pearl Harbor, it was just Japanese Americans, but now it's this sweeping all Asian Americans and elderly Asian Americans being assaulted. In San Francisco, there was this elderly gentleman walking down the sidewalk, and this young man came running down the sidewalk with all that momentum and smacked this old man down on the sidewalk. The impact was so severe that he died. I mean, this kind of thing is happening today because of the coronavirus. But after Pearl Harbor, that's the way we Japanese Americans were targeted. We were called names, spat at, assaulted, and beyond that, our homes and the cars were graffitied. Uh, Japanese American shopkeepers had bricks thrown through their windows. The country went hysterical, mass hysteria, and it reached the so called leaders of our country. In California, we had an attorney general named Earl Warren, who was later to become a very important historic figure. But he was the top attorney of the state of California. Earl Warren was the attorney general. And he made an amazing speech. He said, "We have no reports of sabotage or spying or fifth column activities by Japanese Americans, and that is ominous because the Japanese are inscrutable, that old stereotype. You can't tell what we're thinking. Because they're inscrutable, it would be prudent for us as a preventative to lock them up before they do anything. Before they do anything, lock them up. So, for the top attorney of the state of California, the absence of evidence was the evidence. And uh, the hysteria grew and grew. But he became very popular, ran on that issue of lock up the Japs, a hateful word, lock up the Japs, and he won the race to become governor of California. He was reelected twice, served 3 terms, and then was appointed to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Hysteria took over, and it ultimately stampeded the President of the United States. On February 19th, 1942, he signed Executive Order 9066, which ordered all Japanese Americans on the West Coast, more than 120,000 innocent people of Japanese ancestry, all to be locked up for the duration of the war with no charges, with no trial. Our justice system says if you're arrested, you have a right to know what the charges are, and have the right to challenge it in a court of law. And if all the evidence is there that you did commit whatever you're charged with, then you're punished. In our case, there were no charges, no trial, no due process. One of the pillars of our justice system is equal justice under the law. It's an American ideal which was trampled by the President of the United States, and more than 120,000 of us were rounded up and imprisoned in barbed wire prison camps. I remember that morning, an unforgettable morning that is seared into my memory. My my brother and I was the oldest. My younger brother was 4 years old. I was five. We shared the bedroom. My father came rushing into our bedroom, got us up, dressed us hurriedly, and told us to wait in the living room while our mother and father did some last minute packing in the bedroom. And my baby sister was in a cradle with them in their bedroom. And so my brother and I were just gazing out the front window at the neighborhood. And suddenly we saw two soldiers marching up our driveway. They carried rifles with shiny bayonets on them. They stomped up the front porch and with their fists began pounding on the door. I still remember that pounding. It seemed like the whole house was trembling. My father came rushing out and answered the door, and literally at gunpoint in America, American soldiers were pointing guns at our at innocent us because of our faces and ordered us out of our home. My father went back, uh, had a few packages for my brother and me to carry, and he had two heavy suitcases. And we followed him out onto the driveway and stood there on the driveway waiting for our mother to come out. And finally, when she was escorted out by one of the soldiers, she had our baby sister in one arm, a heavy duffel bag in the other, and tears were streaming down her cheeks. I will never be able to forget that. And so this kind of outrageous injustice happened. We were imprisoned, barbed wire fences, tall sentry towers, machine guns pointed at us, armed soldiers guarding over us. This in America because we happen to look like this, because of our ancestry, our race. This happened in America, and it is an important, vitally important chapter of American history that Americans need to know about. It's an important lesson, and yet so many Americans didn't know that. So it's been my mission in life to raise that awareness. I speak at colleges throughout the country. As a matter of fact, I was invited by Cambridge to speak in England to speak on this chapter of American history. And I guess there was a competition between Cambridge and Oxford. Shortly after I spoke there, we got a call from Oxford. And so
Sure.
we went back to England. And I'm an Anglophile. So my father was an Anglophile. He knew all the kings and queens of England. And so it gave me these wonderful opportunities to go to England and talk about American history. But still, there's not that general knowledge of it. So I happen to be, my husband and I uh, are theater people. We go to the theater regularly when we're in New York. We went to an off Broadway theater and we got there nice and early and we were seated. There were two empty seats in front of us. Two guys came, one an Asian guy and one a tall Caucasian guy. And we were chatting, and the Asian guy recognized my voice, turned around, and he said, "You're George Takei, aren't you?" And I said, yes, I am. And we chatted for a while. Uh, that Asian guy was Jay Kuo. We met him for the first time in this off Broadway theater. And the Caucasian guy next to him was his business partner, his producer. And so we had a nice chat, and they were wonderful theater people. We talked theater. And the next night, we went to see a great big Tony Award winning Broadway musical called uh, um, In the Heights, about the Latino community of the Puerto Rican community in New York, up in uh, 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 the Washington Heights area. And we arrived and we had two aisle seats and we were ready to sit down. And we looked down the aisle, and in the middle of the very same aisle, the night after we first met, were the same two guys. And they recognized us coming down the aisle, and they were waving at us. But because the seats were occupied, they remained in their seats, and we waved over and said, we made this gesture. What do you know? What a small world! And we sat down, and the musical began. And near the end of the first act, the father of this Puerto Rican family sings this song titled Inútil, which means useless. It was a moving song, but that father's singing reminded me of when I was a teenager, and my father and I had after dinner conversations because I was very curious about our my childhood imprisonment, and he told me so much about that uh, experience for him. He was the one that bore the full weight and the loss. Everything that my parents had built up to that point was taken from them by the U.S. government. Their bank account was frozen. All Japanese American bank accounts. We were impoverished, and then the soldiers imprisoned us. And he told me about all of the feelings that he had, and he said he'd look at his children, my brother, me, and our baby sister, who was a toddler in camp, and he felt so useless. The anguish of what's going to happen to his children, and this Puerto Rican father's song, "Useless," reminded me of my father. And I'm one of these people called a crier in the theater. When something hits me, I I don't just sniffle. I try to hold it in. A man doesn't cry in the theater, so I hold it in. But then the water keeps building up behind the dam, and there comes that point when he sang that song, and my dam burst. I don't just sniffle. I go, I make sounds. And then, of course, it's timed that way. The intermission comes, and the lights go blazing on, and people are getting up. And our two new friends came clambering over knees, and they see me quickly wiping my face, and they said, what was that all about? Why did it strike you so profoundly? And I told them, and we chatted about my family's imprisonment during that brief intermission period. And they were intensely interested in that. And that's how Allegiance came about. They went to work, and I consulted with them. I shared my story, and that resulted in Allegiance.
Well, I am so glad they did because I am like you, a theater person. I lived in New York for 9 years on near Broadway, and I remember arriving in New York. It was the 2003, and there was an all Asian cast of Flower Drum Song that David
Oh,
had
yes.
And that was, I cried at the end of it when all of the theater, all the actors identify where they came from. And I, like you, I started crying. And then to see Allegiance again, 2015, so that's 12 years later, a powerful cast, and you played the grandfather. And but I'm curious, the theme of the Allegiance was, the tug of war between the sister Kay and Sam, who ended up joining, who proved his patriotism. He ended up fighting during in World War II, which was not. This is based on the true story as well. We all know the division, the 442, the most decorated, still for that size troop, the most decorated in the military, U.S. military history. So that prove, the idea of having to prove your patriotism, you love your country, and then of course Kay, the challenging the government for the wrongful internment. So I think in the story, I think captures it beautifully. And but then I think the proving of you are a patriot, proving that you're an American. And still, when families are being interned, and then when the internment is over, um, your family also, it took a while to, my understanding is like $25 and a bus ticket out, and you have to rebuild because everything, was confiscated or sold at a discounted price. How did your family rebuild, from that? I mean, and then also another question I have for you is really curious. You talked about your father. Well, did he live long enough to see the a redress? Did he get that check? Not, it's not about the money, but about the recognition by the U.S. government that it was wrongful internment. So I'm curious about the patriotism question, and then also the redress question from your family.
The internment of Japanese Americans, which we wanted to talk about, is a very complex chapter of American history. And so we invented the family, the central family, the Kimura family, with a grandfather, father, and the two children born a decade apart. Uh, they became symbolic of the Japanese American community. And we wanted to examine the idea of allegiance. What does allegiance really mean? Allegiance to country is the usual thought, but also allegiance to your family, that unit. When you're torn between your family and an idea, and ultimately allegiance to oneself, what your values are, what you hold very dear. Those three things: allegiance to country, allegiance to family, and ultimately allegiance to your own values. And so we had this family symbolize the fracturing of the Japanese American community. And what fractured the community was this thing called the Loyalty Questionnaire. Immediately after Pearl Harbor, young Japanese Americans, like all young Americans, rushed to their recruitment centers to volunteer to serve in the U.S. military. This was an act of patriotism, fighting for your country. But because we looked like this, they were denied military service and categorized as enemy aliens and imprisoned in barbed wire prison camps. But a year into imprisonment, the government realized there's a wartime manpower shortage. And here are all these young people that they could have had, but had categorized as enemy aliens and imprisoned. How do you justify drafting enemy aliens out of a prison camp to serve in the military? It was a dilemma that they had, that they solved with a totally irrational outrage, as outrageous as an imprisonment itself. They came down with a loyalty questionnaire. A loyalty questionnaire after they take everything from you, let you go through the trauma of mass hysteria, imprison you in barbed wire prison camps for a year, and then they need us. And so they're going to establish our loyalty. It was the the irrationality of the government and the American people that put us there, not our question of our loyalty. We demonstrated that right after Pearl Harbor. But the loyalty questionnaire was very sloppily put together, and it was rife with racism. It was a series of about 30 questions, but two questions turned all 10 prison camps into turmoil because it was confusing, it was outrageous, it was irrational. Question 27 asked, will you bear arms to defend the United States of America? That, for my parents, meant, will they leave their children in imprisonment and bear arms to defend the United States that's imprisoning their children? It was preposterous. Question 28, the next question, asked, will you swear your loyalty to the United States of America and forswear your loyalty to the Emperor of Japan? Forswear our loyalty to the Emperor. We're Americans. We had no loyalty to the Emperor, but the government presumed that we had an inborn racial loyalty to the Emperor of Japan. So if you answered no, I mean, you answered truthfully, no, I don't have a loyalty to the emperor to forswear, that no applied to the very first part of the very same sentence. Will you swear your loyalty to the United States? What they should have done was broken those two up. Will you swear your loyalty to the United States should be one question. Will you forswear your loyalty to the Emperor of Japan? We could now answer that no truthfully and not get into trouble. They tied the two together. So if you answered no, I don't have a loyalty to the emperor to forswear, that no applied to the first part. If you answered the first part truthfully, I do swear my loyalty to the United States, then that yes meant you were confessing that you did have an existing loyalty to the emperor and were prepared to forswear that and re-swear your loyalty to the United States. The amazing thing is that thousands of young people, men and women, young men, young women, bit the bullet, swallowed the ugly taste, and answered yes to that. Yes to that outrageous, totally irrational question. Yes, that meant they compromised themselves to uh, answer yes. They were drafted and put into a segregated all Japanese American unit, as you said, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and sent to the European theater to fight on those battlefields. But they were used like cannon fodder. Wave after wave after wave of Japanese Americans were gunned down, and the next wave came. They were gunned down, and the next wave came, and that's why the 442nd sustained the highest combat casualty rate of any unit, and that's why they came back as the most decorated, because the most uh, casualties, deaths, were experienced by the 442nd. But the amazing thing is, many of them fought with incredible courage and heroism. Many came back with outstanding records. They came back when they came back, they were granted the Silver Cross, second highest honor, not the highest, although their heroism was eminently deserving of the highest, the highest honor, the Congressional Medal of Honor. Ultimately, many decades after, they were uh, uh, promoted to the highest honor, the Congressional Medal of Honor. But they were elderly men now. Good number of them had passed. I was invited to the White House for that ceremony, to witness that ceremony. They were all elderly. Some had canes. There was one in a wheelchair, and one who became my friend, U.S. Senator Danny Inouye, had a empty sleeve. He lost his right arm in a battlefield in in Europe. That's why they came back as the most decorated unit. They were a group that bit the bullet and swallowed the ugly taste. My parents answered both questions, the controversial questions, truthfully. They said no to the 27th. They will not abandon their children in imprisonment and fight for the country that's imprisoning their children. And they answered um, question 28 uh, because there was a no-win question. You lost with a no and you lost with an yes. The ones that answered yes uh, compromised themselves. They answered both questions truthfully, and for that they were categorized as disloyal. And they were sent to Tule Lake, the most symbolic of the cruelty and the irrationality of the internment. This was a camp bristly with militarism. It was a good symbol of the cruelty and the uh, uh, um, uh, irrationality of the internment. This Tule Lake became the biggest of the 10 internment camps. Most camps were from 6,000 to 11,000 people. Tule Lake held 18,000 people. It had 3 layers of barbed wire fences and machine guns in the sentry towers pointed at us, and a half a dozen tanks patrolling the perimeter. Those tanks belonged on a battlefield, not goading and intimidating people that were already outraged. They're visible, telling them they are prisoners, you're traitors, we're going to treat you as such. And so that was Tule Lake. But there is another group of young men that I consider true American heroes. They were like Kay in Allegiance. Uh, Her boyfriend was a law student at USC and imprisoned. They said they are Americans. We are put into these innocent these prison camps as innocent people. We're not what they're accused of. This is an outrage being perpetrated, and they resisted. And her boyfriend uh, uh, and she joined together in the drama. They were called the resistors, and I consider them true heroes. They said, I am an American and I will fight for my country, but I will fight as an American. If I can report to my hometown draft board with my family back home, I would be like any American. Will have something to fight for. I will fight as an American, but I will not go as an internee, leaving my family in imprisonment, and put on the same uniform as that of the sentries guarding over my family. I will fight as an American. It was a gutsy stance to take on the full might of the United States government. But it was also a principled statement. It made sense, and it was supporting the ideals of American justice, equal justice. And they were demanding that. And it was an American stance. And for that, they were categorized as uh, uh, disloyals and taken from a barbed wire prison camp to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. That's Kay's boyfriend, the young law student. They were put into a federal penitentiary, and they were fighters. Their battlefield was behind those tall concrete walls of a federal penitentiary where they were insulted, spat on, and assaulted. But many of them knew judo, and they very quickly showed the other convicts that they were gutsy people and they knew how to stand for what they stood for. And so there we have the three uh, factions. The loyalty questionnaire divided the community. Those like Sammy who went to fight for the country being compromised, and those that answered with with principle and were sent to Tule Lake, and that was the father in the family, and those that stood on principle principles and they fought for their ideals, and that's Kay and her boyfriend. The community was split in three, and that fracture still exists to this day because the 442nd came back as the winners, and this is again the human frailty. They were the winners, and they vilified those resistors and the ones that stood on principle and had the guts to fight for it. True Americans, and they vilified them, and horrible, horrible tensions remain still.
So, then this goes back to the redress question. In my research, I guess these division existed. Started with the internment, and then finally in I think around 1970, when the redress again different factions
The
started
movement, right?
movement, and then it was not until 1988 when Reagan signed the Civil Liberty Act. But in order for that act to happen, these factions you mentioned had to come together to make it happen. And when Norm Mineta sponsored the bill, that kind of got that bill passed, um, that was a triumph. I imagine. I mean, it took
It
quite a
was.
few years to get the to address this issue of the internee, and then really. So, did your parents live to see that time, or and did you what did your role? I mean, you were already by then in your profession, so if you can touch upon the redress movement for a bit, that would be great.
Well, I was an activist all my life. My father said ours is a participatory democracy, and it's because we were absent that something like the internment happened. And so he encouraged me from the time that I was a teenager to be active in student government. And I did become student body president in middle school and senior board president in high school. So I was active in political issues, in mayoral campaigns, governor's campaigns, U.S. senator campaign, and the campaign for president. And I was an active Democrat. I was a delegate to the 1972 Democratic National Convention. So I've been an activist, and most certainly during the redress period. And I testified at that congressional hearing on my childhood imprisonment, but what I learned over the years from my parents and from the racists. I had a teacher that kept calling me the Jap boy, which stung. We are human beings and fallible. I always wondered why that teacher, Mrs. Rugen, I'll say her name, she was a hateful lady. And I kept wondering, why was that teacher so mean to a kid? I had, had nothing to do with. And then I thought, well, maybe she had a son or a husband in the Pacific Theater. But that still doesn't justify it. I was a child, a student of hers, and she was a teacher, and yet she let her own bile, her prejudice, and she inflicted that on me. And so I grew up with all that, and I shared that. But I also shared in that testimony my conversations with my father. And he was the one that told us that the ideals of this country are noble ideals: equal justice under the law, due process, a government ruled by law. And I learned what we stand for as a nation, the ideals. But I also learned that we have to participate in that, because the people's government, but the people are fallible human beings. We make mistakes. And my father explained to me that President Roosevelt, a great man, was also a human being. He's one of us. We elect a president every 4 years. And that human being who had the role of the presidency made a human mistake and imprisoned innocent people in these camps. And so we have to be active in that. And I shared that in my congressional testimony. And I'm very proud of that. But I also learned by sitting in that hearing room all the other people that testified. And it wasn't all Japanese Americans testifying. And some of the elderly Japanese Americans anguish. They broke down sobbing at that testimony table, were to me moving and also edifying. I learned from their suffering. But I also saw elderly, white haired Caucasian people, and they were saying the same things that my father told me or I read in books. Why were the Japanese fishing on the coast? Because they were fishermen. That's the way they made their living. Why were the Japanese farmers farming near the high tension wire? My maternal grandparents were in farming in the Sacramento Delta. My mother was born there. They were farming what was considered scrap land that they developed, made into bountiful, productive farmland. But they were mouthing those nefarious suspicions that they had of us. We were fishing on the coast because we're fishermen. We were farming in the near the high tension wire because they were considered scrap land. But all these ugly, hateful words, again, I heard from the congressional testimony stands. But when Congress acted, they acted. And one of the great leaders was my friend, the United States Senator from Hawaii, Dan Inoue, who ultimately got the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was a hero with the 442nd. And because of them, our story was told. And because of us, those of us that testified, the story was told. I told it from my childhood experience, but also I learned as I grew up, and I that's in my and in the Japanese American National Museum just this year unearthed. I I had it written down, but I lost it. But they found my testimony, the transcripts of that, and they had me read that for the gala fundraising dinner that we have annually, but this year was virtual. So I virtually uh, made that testimony speech again at the fundraising ceremony. And it was a moving experience when President Ronald Reagan uh, formally, officially representing the United States government, apologized for a grave mistake and signed the Civil Liberties Act, which pledged that $20,000 uh, recompense. I donated mine to the Japanese American National Museum because I was too young to really experience the pain and the anguish and the and the outrage of that experience. My father was the one that bore that the most in our family. He had passed in 1979, and that apology would have meant so much for my father, and he passed never to know. And you had to be alive at that point when President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act. And so my mother, as his widow, got her own $20,000, but she did not get my father's $20,000. But I only wish that he had lived to see that and experience that, because he was the one that shared with me what I know of what they went through. My mother was a strong lady too, but she was not as verbal. She just hated the experience. But my father understood that experience on an intellectual level as well as viscerally. And so I am the product of my father and his idealism, a strange way to say it, but and that's how we put together allegiance with music. And when I told Senator Inoue that we're planning, we're developing this musical, he looked at me seriously and said, "A musical on the internment? That was a painful experience, and you're going to sing and dance about it?" And that's a normal, understandable reaction. But I wanted to incorporate my father's philosophy. He said, there's that song Gamang, which means endurance, resilience. But he said, resilience isn't all just teeth gritting, uh, 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 fist making uh, strength to bear uh, pain. It's also the strength to find beauty in the harsh circumstances and to make our own joy under those oppressive circumstances. He said, "We that to live is also resilience." And he was a block manager because he spoke both Japanese and English fluently, and he was able to speak to the two generations, the immigrant generation and the American-born generation, and particularly with the young people, teenagers. They have all that energy, and they shouldn't be in that depression. And my father was a baseball player before the internment, or before he got married in San Francisco. He was a member of a baseball team, and they traveled the Bay Area playing other Japanese American baseball teams. And so he led the way to getting a baseball diamond built in our block. And he also got the camp command to allow us to have a record player brought into camp every other month. And after dinner in the mess hall, the tables were dragged away and the benches were lined up at the edges of the wall. And they had dances for young people. So we did sing and dance and play baseball in camp to live, to show our resilience. And that's why a musical was appropriate way of telling the story. We had that song Gamang, which means resilience, but we demonstrated how you gamang. It's not just enduring with muscles flexed. It's also to create our joy And people fell in love because of those dances. And babies were born, as in the case of Kay, behind barbed wire. And we have members of our family that were born in a prison camp. So we wanted to tell that story entertainingly, but also truthfully. And yet, people in the Japanese Americans are very picky, fussy, and they love to complain. And they said, we didn't have a blonde white nurse in our camp. That was made up. No, that was to tell the story and the heartbreak and the irrationality of and singing and dancing. Yes, we did sing and dance. And I remember our barrack was right across from the mess hall, and my mother hated that because of the smell. You know, a quarter of the barrack of the mess hall was the kitchen, and the smell of the kitchen. But also, what she really hated was every night they cleaned out the mess hall and they used a disinfectant, you know, and the stinging smell of that. I remember she was always complaining about the smell. Uh, but what I remember is she put us to bed, and I heard the big band music, the sounds of Tommy Dorsey and Benny Goodman wafting over the night air to our barrack. And so relate to the music of the 1940s because that's what I dropped off to sleep listening to. And so a musical is really the most truthful way of telling the story of the internment of Japanese Americans.
Well, we've had an hour-long conversation, but I want to end by asking you this last question. We are this May, we know is Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and this is every May. We commemorate and recognize Asian American API achievements. And this year is very poignant and very, unfortunately, very sad, as you mentioned earlier, the anti-Asian hate crimes. And it's also around May 26th, a year ago. Uh, it was exactly a year ago when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. So, in this, and also in this really strange time of COVID, and you talk about resilience, I think this is something we need. But what is your parting word for Asian Americans? Or people who don't know. I think sometime here in Hong Kong, people wonder, what's that got to do with us here in Hong Kong? Discrimination. Here in Hong Kong, where we Asians are majority. So, can you talk about the importance of to you, a message about, the importance of remembering our history and the API Heritage Month that you have been involved with, for decades, but kind of in this really troubling time, um, is it worth commemorating? And what do you hope to see for the future, as we're seeing an Asian, somebody who used to have Earl Warren's job, Kamala Harris, now as vice president. So there has been progress, but at the same time, we also are in this kind of trouble era. So what do you kind of take away from it, and some of your parting thoughts?
Allegiance to country, to family, and ultimately to yourself applies to Hong Kong, as well as what's happening in the United States today again. I think it's the core message from Allegiance. But I also think of a show that I'm most identified with, Star Trek. We have what we called the Vulcan Greeting, alien people, alien life forms greeting each other. It goes like this. And the words that go with this gesture is live long and prosper. It is so pregnant with meaning. Let us live long and let us truly prosper, and not just in monetary ways, but what life means. Live life fully and richly. That's prosperity. Live long and prosper.
Thank you, George. I hope everybody enjoyed tonight's discussion, and I thank you for your leadership, your activism, and you know you're right, participatory, and you have certainly uh, been a great example of that. So thank you for being with us this evening to talk about allegiance, and I hope the audience enjoy it, and we look forward to having another discussion in a few nights after the second showing with your fellow cast member,
Mm.
Telly Long and Leah Salonga. So we're looking forward to the event in a few days. So thank you, George, for being with us tonight, and I look forward to reading your book and giving that as a gift to my many young friends. I think our history, whether it's in musicals, whether it's in manga, or in novels, it's all worth telling. If we don't tell it, who's? It reminds me of another musical. Who's going to tell our story? And that is very, very important. Thank you for telling our story. Thank you, George.
Thank you very much, Alice Mong, and I appreciate this opportunity to share my thoughts.
Thank you.